The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the offensive phase of Operation Epic Fury against Iran is now complete. That he characterized Project Freedom to free stranded ships in the Strait of Hormuz as defensive.
Mr. Rubio urged Iran to return to the negotiating table and make a sensible choice, saying Tehran must comply with U.S. demands to end the war.
Well, the development comes amid more reported drone and missile strikes against the UAE. Iran has categorically denied it carried out the attacks. Now into its third month of the conflict, the Strait of Hormuz remains virtually shut, wreaking havoc on fuel and other supplies, driving prices up for people all over the world.
For more, let's speak to John Blaxland. He's director of the ANU North America Liaison and Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at the Australian National University. And he joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Professor Blaxland, good to have you back on the show. Thank you very much for joining us. So help me make sense of what we're hearing right now. You have Dan Kane saying Iran attacked U.S. forces 10 times, during the ceasefire. You have Pete Hegseth, saying the ceasefire is still intact. And then you have Marco Rubio, saying there's no shooting unless U.S. forces are shot at first. And then also, apparently, Trump is now saying that Project Freedom is on pause. Is this what you expect in a ceasefire? Meaning it's a test of wills at the margins with a return to full-scale war just one incident away?
No, it's a great question, and it's not one that's easy to answer, to be honest. It's very difficult to figure out what's going to happen next because a lot depends on what's happening in the mind of the President of the United States, as well as in the regime in Tehran. They're both being quite stubborn. They're both being quite determined. And of course, the situation as it stands at the moment is one that's considerably worse than was the case prior to the beginning of hostilities back in February the 28th. So we have a situation where the United States is claiming that they've had a cessation of hostilities, but the situation has not yet reverted. And so it'll be very interesting to see what negotiations can be reached in the discussions in Beijing. Of course, this all needs to be seen in the context of what President Trump is hoping to achieve in Beijing in a few weeks himself. And we know that Beijing has actually been playing a significant supportive role technologically and in terms of other national security intelligence-related aspects. And they've also been getting support from Russia. So the equation in Iran cannot be seen purely in terms of the bilateral exchange between the United States and Iran itself, let alone the one with Israel. This is a very complicated set of circumstances. Of course, we know the United States has also spent the overwhelming proportion of the ammunition that it had taken with them for this deployment. So refueling, restocking, re-equipping, re-preparing is not something that they can do easily. And so reverting to what they were doing before is not something they can really afford to do, coupled with the fact that America is starting to hurt. I mean, the rest of the world has been hurting for some time. Singapore, Australia, Japan, much of Africa and beyond have been experiencing considerable financial pain, and that pain is likely to continue for some time. So the United States is under pressure to make concessions here too, not just Iran. And that means that it's really very difficult to say how this is going to unfold next. But there are a number of variables to unpack.
Specifically, I want to ask you about Mr. Trump's announcement on pausing this Project Freedom, which lasted about a couple of days now. I mean, from Iran's perspective, I wonder how they're reading this move. I mean, would this pausing of operation risk giving Iran greater leverage over the Strait?
So there is, the situation at the moment is that Iran retains considerable leverage. They still are able to operate a number of drones, not nearly as many as before. They're still able to operate some small boats, not nearly as many as before, but enough to cause consternation, enough to raise the level of unease about free flow of ships passing through, even though it may well be physically feasible to do so. There will continue to be a reluctance for insurance companies to back that and to encourage these vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz in a sense oblivious to what else might be happening. This is not going to be resolved anytime soon. In terms of, there's a number of aspects you can unpack here. The implications of the hundreds of vessels that are stuck on either side of the strait that are needing to transit to get to their destination is significant. I think it's also worth noting that while this is seen as something that the United States is acting on and is holding back on, the United States is also consulting closely, it appears, with a number of the Gulf states. And the Gulf states, of course, have several hundred naval vessels themselves, and they have a role to play in actually negotiating the free passage, negotiating the terms, if you like, for unblocking the Strait of Hormuz. So this isn't something that is completely and solely reliant on the United States, even though the United States has been appealing to, in recent days, to NATO and other countries like Japan and Australia and China to help. The bottom line is there are hundreds of naval vessels in the Gulf itself from the Gulf states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, that are actually in a better position to directly be involved if they are to be called upon. So this is something that hasn't really been talked about yet very much. So there are options there if the United States wants to pursue it with those Gulf Cooperation states. But of course, at the same time, Iran, it's got limits. It can't keep this up forever because of the significant imposition of financial constraints. So everybody's feeling pain here. The question is who feels the most pain politically and economically, and who then feels, as a result of that imposition of pain, the requirement to back off further first. Of course, the United States rhetoric coming out in the last few days, particularly in the last couple of hours, would suggest the Americans are really keen to drop the pain threshold. They want a relief at the pump. They want a relief of expenses, but that's not something that they can control on their own.
So, Professor, if you were asked to describe, Operation Project Freedom, what would you say? Would you call it a freedom? Would you call it successful? Would you call it a work in progress? I mean, the question, I guess, is can the U.S., essentially keep the war frozen while opening the Strait of Hormuz in the meantime?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. What does freedom look like, and what does success look like? This is something that the terms of the conflict have actually shifted repeatedly over the last couple of months. It's actually, as an outsider looking in, trying to make sense of all this, as we all are, it's very difficult to discern exactly where you draw the line, where you say, okay, I've achieved enough. And I can claim success, because, of course, this is more than just about the Strait of Hormuz. This is about the regime. This is about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is about the mullahs in Tehran. This is about the nuclear stockpile inside Iran. This is, let's not forget, this war started with a deal between the United States and Israel to deal with the regime, to try and topple the regime and to see an alternative government emerge. Now, what's happened is not nearly that. But of course, what happens the day after a cessation of conflict could be something very different to what we're seeing today. And a lot of pundits out there are hoping that perhaps there's enough of a pain threshold problem for Iran that this will generate that eventual resurgence of resentment and uprising that led to the kind of groundswell of support for a change of government like we saw in 1979, but with more success than we saw in January, when 30 to 40,000 Iranians were killed at the hands of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, daring to stand up for freedom, for a change of a direction of the state. Remembering, of course, that Iran remains a supporter of Hezbollah in Lebanon, of the Houthis in Yemen, and is still supporting Hamas as with much more limited way, of course, in Gaza. these are all institutions that are widely considered odious, that are seen as behind significant atrocities, which are compounded by the actions in the last couple of months, of course. This is a very difficult set of circumstances. It's not going to be resolved quickly. And even if we do see the Strait of Hormuz opened successfully in the coming days, be it with escorts or be it with an Iranian backdown, the knock-on effects are arguably the likes of a tidal wave. This is something that a number of pundits are starting to observe, and this is in stark contrast to the interesting rosy economic forecast in the previous segment, that while we've been able to sustain the flow of oil and refined products through the refineries in Singapore, Korea, China, and elsewhere, a lot of that is dependent on flow from the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, that's now stopped for more than 2 months. You can compensate for some of that from the United States, from Brunei, and from other places, but you can't fully compensate for it. And so the knock-on economic consequences of the drying up of the pump, of the rising of the prices, of the slowdown of international air traffic, this is going to be felt for a long time. We can all hope and pray that actually starts today, that there is some resolution now, because the longer it takes, the worse it's going to get.
All right, Dr. Blaxland, we have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Professor John Blaxland, International Security and Intelligence Studies at ANU. Thank you.